November 1942. North Africa, Sahara Desert. The blinding sun of the Sahara Desert beat down on the American soldiers like a hammer. It was a relentless, unforgiving heat that seemed to sap their strength, and after months of fighting in the blistering desert, they were tired, bone-weary tired. Their ration packs had been whittled down to nothing, and even the remnants of their meals could hardly keep the hunger at bay. Bread turned to dust in their mouths and the canned meat tasted like rubber. Morale was low, and the soldiers could barely remember the last time they had felt a semblance of satisfaction after eating. The battle for North Africa had been dragging on for months. The Axis forces, led by General Erwin Rommel, were pushing the Allies to the edge. Every day felt like a losing battle. Rommel's Afrika Korps had proven themselves to be formidable, and with every Allied loss, the desert seemed to take more than it gave. The soldiers were exhausted and depleted, and their bodies had become fragile from dehydration, infection, and most of all, fatigue. In the distance, the sound of artillery fire echoed through the sand dunes, and the shrill whistle of incoming bombs pierced the air. It was as if the war was pressing in from all sides. Every soldier knew they couldn't keep up the pace much longer, not with the conditions they were enduring. Their feet were raw from the endless miles of marching, their clothes were torn and stained from weeks of wear, and hunger gnawed at their stomachs like a persistent ache. Then there was the heat, always the heat. The desert was an inferno, turning the earth beneath their boots into a furnace. They couldn't rest because even the shadows offered little relief from the sun. It felt like the desert itself was a living, breathing thing, just as hungry and relentless as their enemies. But in the midst of this war-torn chaos, something small and unexpected was about to change the fate of these soldiers. December 1942. A farm in the United States. Back across the Atlantic in the quiet fields of the Midwest, life seemed a world apart from the chaos of war. Here, amidst the green fields and rustic barns, one farmer, John G. Clark, was about to make a decision that would seem ridiculous to most, but one that would ultimately alter the course of the war. John Clark wasn't a general or a military strategist. He was just a honey farmer from a small rural town. But Clark, like many Americans during this time, was deeply concerned about the war effort. He had heard reports of soldiers suffering in the Sahara Desert, barely surviving on minimal rations. He couldn't help but wonder if he could help somehow. His farm had seen its share of hard work, but none of it compared to the efforts of those fighting overseas. As a beekeeper, Clark had an idea. For years he had known that honey wasn't just a sweet treat, it was a natural energy booster. He remembered how, on long days when he had worked in the fields, a spoonful of honey had given him the extra energy to keep going. But his idea wasn't just about energy, it was about sustenance. Clark had read how honey was known for its antibacterial properties and had even been used during the Civil War to treat wounds. Could it be the key to fighting off fatigue and infection in the harsh conditions of the desert? Could it give soldiers the strength to keep moving through the grueling, exhausting days? It was a simple solution, one that many might consider a stupid trick, but Clark believed it might help. So he began packing his best raw honey into crates and sending it off to the military. The army was skeptical, but they had been through desperate times. The supply lines were stretched thin, and they weren't exactly in a position to turn down any help, however unconventional it may have seemed. Little did anyone know that this small gesture, this unremarkable act of a simple farmer, would end up saving lives on the front lines of North Africa. January 1943. North Africa, Allied headquarters. The crates of honey, delivered to the Allied forces in North Africa, arrived quietly. At first, no one took much notice of them, just another shipment in a sea of rations. The soldiers had their hands full fighting the Afrika Korps and keeping up with the ever-dwindling food supplies. But as the honey started to be distributed, something surprising began to happen. The soldiers, already exhausted by the constant march and combat, began to report something unexpected. They felt better. They weren't just getting a little energy boost, they were feeling stronger, more alert, and less fatigued. Their minds cleared, and they found themselves able to focus on their tasks for longer periods. Some of the soldiers started to ask questions. What was this honey and why did it seem to help so much? It was simple, they soon realized. The honey provided a quick source of energy without the crash that came from other forms of sugar. It was natural, sustaining them through the brutal heat of the desert. Word quickly spread among the men. The honey was more than just a treat, it was their secret weapon. It helped them endure the harsh desert environment, where even the most well-equipped soldiers struggled. The honey's ability to provide sustained energy became so vital that it became part of their regular rations. They started referring to it as their desert fuel, a small miracle in the form of a jar. In the face of dwindling rations and relentless exhaustion, this humble gift from a farmer back in the United States became a lifeline. Soldiers on the front lines found that their energy levels increased, that they were less prone to fatigue and more capable of enduring the long days. They could march further, fight harder, and stay in the battle longer than they could have otherwise. It was an unexpected source of strength, a small, stupid trick from a farmer that changed the course of the war. No one could have guessed how much this simple addition to their rations would impact their ability to fight. But it did. It made all the difference. By February 1943, the Battle of Tunisia was in full swing. The American forces, struggling against Rommel's Afrika Korps, were at a critical point. The Allied forces had been pushed to their limits. Supplies were dwindling, morale was sinking, and it seemed like defeat was inevitable. The desert had chewed up men, vehicles, and resources, and the soldiers had been fighting for so long that they could hardly remember the last time they had felt strong. But then something changed. It wasn't a new weapon or a bold military strategy, it was the honey. The small jars that had been quietly integrated into the rations had proven more than just a quick fix. They were now a vital tool in the soldiers' survival. Those who had been sluggish, those who had struggled to stay awake during the long days and sleepless nights, now felt revitalized. The energy boost they got from the honey was sustained, not fleeting, and it helped them recover faster between battles. The soldiers began to realize that they could push harder and longer without the usual fatigue slowing them down. Stamina improved, focus sharpened. The effects of the honey weren't just physical, they were psychological too. Knowing they had the energy to endure, knowing they could face the harsh desert without the crushing weight of exhaustion, gave them a renewed sense of confidence. At a pivotal moment during the Battle of Tunisia, as the Afrika Korps tried to tighten their grip, the American soldiers held the line. They counterattacked, using their newfound energy to push back the Axis forces. It wasn't just about strength or firepower, it was about staying power, the ability to outlast the enemy in a war of attrition. Honey, of all things, had become their secret weapon. It gave them that extra edge, the kind that made a difference in every battle. As the battle raged on, the Americans were able to gain ground. With the boost of energy provided by the honey, their soldiers were more alert, and their reflexes were sharper. Their supply lines held up longer, and the Afrika Korps found themselves facing a force that could endure far more than they expected. And so, a turning point in the war had been reached, not with tanks, not with bombs, but with a farm product from the Midwest. The desert fuel that had sustained American soldiers helped them win a battle that had once seemed impossible to win. June 1943. United States, Washington, D.C. By June 1943, the impact of Clark's honey was undeniable. As the Allied forces pushed forward in North Africa, their victory in Tunisia was seen as a significant turning point in the war. The honey, now a permanent part of their rations, was credited with keeping the soldiers alert, focused, and full of energy during one of the harshest campaigns in the war. In Washington, D.C., the military leaders took notice. The success of this simple addition to the rations made headlines in some circles. Clark's unassuming contribution was now regarded as an unsung hero's victory. It was said that without it, the soldiers' ability to keep up the fight would have been severely hampered. Clark was invited to the military supply offices to discuss how his honey had helped the war effort. Soldiers from the front lines wrote letters of gratitude, explaining how they could endure the exhausting desert campaigns because of the energy boost they got from the honey. Some called it their desert gold. Yet even as Clark was honored for his contribution, he remained humble. The war was still raging and Clark was just one man, one farmer, in a sea of countless others. Still, he felt a deep sense of pride. His farm had become part of the American war machine, and that jar of honey had somehow become a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and resourcefulness. The military began experimenting with more natural, non-conventional supplements like honey for soldiers, realizing how it not only boosted their physical energy but helped keep them mentally sharp. Honey became a symbol of how the smallest of contributions could make the biggest impact. Clark's simple act had made him a quiet hero in a war full of giants. 1944. Europe, Allied headquarters. As the war entered its final stages, the American forces, now operating across Europe, looked back at the small victories that had led them to their ultimate success. Clark's honey, which had once been dismissed as a stupid trick, was now an integral part of the rations for soldiers in both the European theater and the Pacific theater. The war was nearing its end, and as the soldiers marched through the cities of Europe that had once been Nazi strongholds, they could feel the weight of their sacrifices. But even as they celebrated their victories, there was a quiet recognition that every small part of the war effort had contributed to their success. The battlefields were full of stories of bravery, strategy, and heroism, but they were also full of stories of simple acts that had made a huge difference. Clark's contribution, humble though it was, had been part of that fabric. The honey had made it possible for soldiers to keep going longer, to push past their limits when it seemed impossible to continue. And while the world would remember the major battles, Normandy, Iwo Jima, Stalingrad, the story of a farmer's ingenuity would fade into history. But for those who had fought and survived, Clark's honey would forever be tied to the memories of the grueling desert campaigns and the sustained strength that had won the war. It was a symbol of how ordinary people, with the simplest tools, could play an extraordinary role in shaping history. In the years that followed, Clark's name was remembered in small corners of the war effort. He had provided more than just honey. He had provided a lasting legacy of hope, perseverance, and human ingenuity. The impact of his actions would ripple through history as a reminder that even the most unassuming people, with the smallest acts, could change the course of world events. Post-war 1945. Across America. In the aftermath of the war, as American soldiers returned home to parades and celebrations, they carried with them the stories of their experiences, the bravery, the fear, the camaraderie, and the victories. And among those stories was one that had become legendary. The story of Clark's honey, a tale that had spread from the front lines to the heart of America, was passed down as part of the narrative of how victory was won. The Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and other allied nations had contributed to the war effort in countless ways, but it was the Americans, with their ingenuity, who had proved time and again that it wasn't just the weapons that won wars, it was the will to keep fighting. From honey to duct tape to simple ingenuity, Americans had shown the world that brains could beat bullets. Clark, now an elderly man, never sought fame. He returned to his farm, quietly tending to his bees, never fully aware of the full extent of the impact his small gesture had made on the world. He had helped feed millions, had helped soldiers win battles they thought they might lose, and had been part of something greater than himself. And so, the story of Clark's honey became part of the collective memory of World War II, a tale that would be passed down through generations as a symbol of the unsung heroes who made the world a better place, not with guns but with simple acts of courage, ingenuity, and hope.